People often say betrayal comes from the place you least expect. I never believed that until the day everything I trusted collapsed. For 7 years, I cared for my sick wife, arranging every medication, every appointment, every hospital visit. That morning, she told me she was going to the hospital for another kidney check. 1 hour later, my phone rang. It was the bank. "Sir, your wife is here right now," the bank employee whispered. "And she's sitting with a man who looks exactly like you." In that moment, my world stopped. Hello everyone, welcome to this story. Before we continue, please take a second to like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from today. I love seeing how far these stories travel. A quick note, some elements are fictionalized for storytelling, and any resemblance to people or places is purely coincidental. The scent of honey-glazed chicken usually meant peace in my house, but today, the air felt thick with a chill I couldn't explain. I'm Mitchell Pierce, a 62-year-old former senior bridge inspector with a gaze that could find a hairline fracture in steel, stood at my kitchen counter, precisely at 5:15 p.m. The golden October light filtered through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing over the butcher block. I moved with a practiced mechanical precision, slicing the poultry into uniform strips for Margaret's low-sodium dinner. For 7 long years, I hadn't just been a husband. I had been a full-time, unpaid nurse for a woman whose condition never seemed to improve despite my engineering-level care. I had traded the structural integrity of Chicago's infrastructure for the fragile architecture of a dying woman's hope. "Just another hour, Mitch," I told myself as I scraped the carrots. "She needs you." The structural integrity of a marriage is found in the sacrifices you don't talk about. Margaret was supposed to be at Memorial Grace Hospital right now, tethered to a machine for her grueling kidney dialysis checkup. I checked the wall clock again, verifying the time. My life was a series of scheduled maintenance intervals, and I prided myself on never missing a beat. I wiped my hands on my apron, the familiar weight of my heavy chef's knife reassuring in my palm. The kitchen was silent, save for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant rustle of leaves against the pane. Everything was in its proper place. Have you ever felt the ground vanish beneath your feet while standing on solid oak? The vibration started as a low thrum against the butcher block, the kitchen phone rattling with a persistent, cold urgency. I ignored it at first, assuming it was another solicitor trying to sell me insurance I didn't need or a reverse mortgage I couldn't afford. But the caller ID flashed Silverstone Trust and Investments. My pulse quickened. This was the bank handling my late father's legacy trust, a probate process that had been dragging on for months. I set the knife down and answered, expecting a dry update from a clerk. Instead, the voice on the other end was Daniel, a young junior associate I had spoken to twice before. He sounded like he was hyperventilating. "Mr. Pierce, it's Daniel from the bank," he stammered, his voice dropping to a frantic whisper. "I'm breaking every rule by calling your personal cell." I frowned, leaning against the counter. "Daniel, I'm right in the middle of dinner. Is the probate cleared?" My mind was already calculating the bills this trust would cover. "Sir, I know what I'm seeing," Daniel whispered, and I could hear the sheer terror in his tone. "Your wife is here. Margaret is sitting in the VIP suite right now." I felt a sharp spike of irritation. "That's impossible, Daniel. She's at Memorial Grace for dialysis. I dropped her off myself." He didn't skip a beat. "Sir, I am looking through the glass. She is right here, and she is with you. Or at least she's with someone who has your face. He's wearing your charcoal suit, Mitchell. He has your watch." The knife hit the floor. The blade sang against the tile. A perfect fracture. I stared at the shimmering steel by my feet, my brain refusing to process the data. "I'm standing in my kitchen." I shouted into the phone, my voice cracking with a sudden raw anger. "He's signing the papers." Mitchell Daniel hissed, the sound of paper rustling audible over the line. He's signing your legal name on the final legacy trust documents. He's taking the entire inheritance. If you aren't here in 12 minutes to prove who you are, you're a dead man on paper. The garage door groaned open like a heavy tomb, and I didn't wait for it to clear the roof of my truck before I slammed the gear into reverse. My knuckles were already white against the steering wheel, my mind replaying Daniel's frantic warning like a looped recording of a plane crash. 12 minutes. I had 12 minutes to stop a ghost from erasing my existence. As I cleared the driveway, the smell of burning rubber and hot engine oil filled the cabin, a sharp contrast to the honeyed warmth of the kitchen I had just abandoned. I swung the truck onto the main road, weaving through the aggressive late-afternoon Chicago traffic with a recklessness that would have horrified me 20 minutes ago. Every red light felt like a personal insult, a crimson barrier designed to strip away the life I had meticulously built. I began to realize with a sickening clarity that usually only comes after a bridge collapse, that Margaret's kidney failure symptoms always conveniently flared up exactly when I was due for major project promotions or site inspections. 7 years of systematic career sabotage flashed before my eyes as I narrowly missed a delivery van. I had been an engineer of steel and concrete, but I had been blind to the rot in my own living room. "Move, damn it, move!" I shouted at a stalled sedan, my voice raw and unfamiliar. 12 minutes. I can't lose 10 years in 12 minutes. I pushed the vehicle to its limit, the roar of the engine a cathartic release for the adrenaline coursing through my veins. Time wasn't a river anymore. It was a noose tightening around the neck of my father's legacy. As the skyline of the city blurred into a streak of glass and gray, my mind drifted back to the day I stood in the director's office at the DOT. I remembered the heavy weight of my resignation letter, the dry texture of the paper beneath my thumb. I was throwing away the best engineering mind in the state the director had told me, his eyes full of a pity I had mistaken for respect. "My wife's life is the only structure I care about fixing now," I had replied. I remembered the way Claire, Margaret's sister, had looked at me that night, her eyes gleaming with a satisfaction I now recognized as victory. She had called me a career-obsessed ghost for months, hollowing out my resolve until I snapped. I had walked away from a brilliant career because I believed my presence at home was the only thing keeping Margaret alive. Now I saw the truth through the windshield of a speeding truck. I hadn't been a savior. I had been a prisoner. The bitterness rose in my throat, acrid and hot. I had traded the skyline for a sick room, and all the while the woman I loved was likely preparing for the day someone would step into my charcoal suit and take the rest. Do you know what it's like to realize you've been the architect of your own prison for 7 years? I screeched into the parking lot of Silverstone Trust and Investments, the tires screaming as I bypassed the main entrance. My heart hammered against my ribs with such force it felt like it might crack a bone. I spotted it immediately. Margaret's dark green BMW X5 plate RVR 8394 parked crookedly near the VIP entrance. The glint of the setting sun off the paint was blinding. RVR 8394. "You weren't at Memorial Grace, were you?" I whispered the words, tasting like ash. I parked my truck 10 feet away and jumped out my boots, hitting the asphalt hard. As I ran past the BMW, I glanced through the rear window. There, tucked half under the driver's seat, was a professional-grade makeup kit peeking out from the shadows. Silicone adhesives and flesh-toned palettes spilled across the floor mat. The man inside wasn't just a look-alike. He was a carefully manufactured double. God, please let me be wrong. Just once, let me be wrong. But I knew the structural integrity of my life had failed. I saw Daniel standing at the side employee entrance, his face as pale as a sheet, frantically waving me toward the shadow of the corridor. The transition from the roar of Chicago traffic to the sterile, carpeted silence of the bank felt like entering a vacuum where the oxygen was being replaced by ice. Daniel, a sharp-featured bank employee in his late 20s, whose life I had saved during a bridge failure years ago, looked like he was witnessing a ghost. He grabbed my arm, his fingers digging into my jacket. With a strength born of pure adrenaline, and pulled me through the side employee entrance. The heavy security door clicked shut behind us, severing my connection to the world outside. I followed him through a maze of narrow, windowless back hallways, my boots thudding rhythmically against the expensive industrial carpet. Every step felt like I was descending deeper into a structural flaw I couldn't repair. Daniel was whispering as we walked, his eyes darting toward every security camera we passed. He explained that the bank's automated systems hadn't flagged the man in the suite. Everything looked perfect on paper. The only reason he had called my personal cell was because of a thank you note I had sent to the branch a month ago. I had embossed the corner with my unique engineering stamp, a small detail the imposter's sophisticated documents lacked. It was a hairline fracture in an otherwise seamless forgery. "He sounds like you, Mr. Pierce." Daniel murmured, his voice trembling as we bypassed a cluster of oblivious tellers. "He moves like you. He even has that slight hitch in his shoulder from your old injury. But the eyes are too hungry." "I'm right here, Daniel," I replied, my voice sounding hollow in the air-conditioned void. "I've been here for 62 years. Whoever is in that room is a phantom." I felt a cold sweat prickling my neck as we approached a heavy steel door marked Security Operations. Silence. The kind of silence that precedes a bridge collapse. The air in the back corridor smelled of ozone and stale coffee, a scent that will forever be linked to the death of my previous life. Daniel swiped his badge and punched a rapid-fire code into the keypad. We entered a small, cramped room dominated by a wall of monitors casting a blue, flickering light over our faces. The low hum of computer servers filled the space, sounding like a digital heartbeat. Daniel didn't speak. He just reached for the console and hit a command. Monitor 4 flickered the grainy texture of the security feed, smoothing out to show the interior of Conference Room A. My heart stopped. I watched in absolute paralyzed horror as my wife Margaret, the woman I had spent 7 years nursing, the woman I believed was currently tethered to a dialysis machine, sat tall and elegant in a leather chair. She wasn't pale. She wasn't shaking. She was glowing. She sat there laughing casually, drinking bottled water while chatting with a man who sat in the chair next to her. He wore my charcoal suit. He had my glasses perched on his nose. He even wore my father's gold wedding band. How many thousands of hours had I spent holding her hand while she pretended to be dying? The question tore through me like a jagged piece of shrapnel. "Look at her, Mitchell," Daniel said softly, his face illuminated by the harsh blue light of the screen. "Does she look like a woman who needs a kidney transplant to you?" I couldn't answer. I watched her reach over and affectionately stroke the imposter's hand, whispering something into his ear that made him throw his head back in a silent laugh. It was a gesture of effortless intimacy, a touch of genuine warmth she hadn't shown me in over a decade. I felt a cold, industrial rage beginning to crystallize in my chest, replacing the panic. I watched the monitor as the man with my face leaned in close to Margaret, and for the first time, I saw the true hunger Daniel had described. Not for her, but for the stack of legacy documents sitting between them. I didn't waste another second watching the phantom on the screen. I reached for my phone, my fingers moving with the cold, mechanical precision of a man structuralizing a counter-assault. My eyes remained locked on the graininess of Monitor 4, where the man wearing my face was currently laughing at a joke my wife had likely made a dozen times before. The rage was there, deep and industrial, but I forced it into the background. I needed a legal fortress, and I needed it now. I tapped the contact for Victor Hayes, a 60-year-old top-tier asset attorney with a voice like gravel and a reputation for being a shark in a tailored suit, and he picked up the call on the first ring. "Victor, they're in the room right now," I said, my voice coming out as a controlled rasp. "They're signing away 30 years of my life. I need an immediate lockdown on the legacy trust." Victor didn't ask for a preamble. He knew my father's estate inside out. He had been the one to help my father set up the trust with a poison pill clause that required my specific physical authorization for any transfer over a million A clause only I can deactivate if I act before the notary's seal is dry. I'm already on it, Mitchell Victor growled. I'm drafting the emergency injunction as we speak. Don't confront them yet. If you storm that room, they'll pivot to a backup plan. Let the law be your hammer. I paced the small security room, the smell of ionized air and electric tension thick enough to taste. Daniel sat at the console, his face pale under the glare of the fluorescent security lights, reflecting off my sweat-beaded forehead. I watched the imposter lean over a document, his hand moving with a fluidity that mocked my own. A bridge doesn't fall all at once. It screams through the rivets first. My life was screaming, and I was the only one listening. I hung up with Victor and immediately initiated a second call. Samuel Torres, a 35-year-old private investigator with a genius-level intellect for digital forensics and a permanent 5 o'clock shadow, spoke with the frantic energy of a man who lived on caffeine and data. Samuel, find out where the digital ghost of my identity lives, I commanded. I want every password, every login, and every remote access point Claire or Margaret has touched in the last year. Samuel's keyboard clattered like a hailstone on a tin roof in the background. If that notary hits submit on the digital terminal before I can flag the transaction, Mitchell, we're chasing smoke across the Atlantic, he warned. They'll have that money moved through 3 offshore layers in the time it takes you to blink. I could feel the frantic tapping of my fingers on the edge of the security console, a rhythmic manifestation of the clock winding down. Tick, tick. The legacy was bleeding. I looked back at the monitor. Margaret was glowing, her face devoid of the sickly pallor I had tended to for 7 years. It was a masterpiece of deception. Just as I was about to signal Daniel to get me closer to the terminal, my phone buzzed with an incoming text from Victor. I swiped it open, my heart hammering. Mitchell. I've hit a snag, Victor said as I brought the phone back to my ear. Mitchell, the injunction will only hold if you can provide your engineering seal at the bank's terminal, Victor said. Your father embedded a failsafe. Any transfer over 5 million requires not just biometrics, but your DOT engineering seal with your unique inspector ID. Ryan can fake your fingerprint with silicon, but he can't fake 30 years of certification. I felt the cold steel seal in my pocket. He doesn't have it. Then get there before he finds a way to bypass it. It turned the legal battle into a race against the clock, a sprint toward a terminal that was less than 100 yards away, yet seemingly on another planet. I felt the cold realization settle in. Victor's voice then dropped to a low, dangerous whisper that chilled the sweat on my neck. I've sent the draft, Mitchell, but I found something in the ledger you didn't tell me about, something that makes no sense. I snatched the warm pages from the printer, the ink still fresh enough to smudge, but the numbers were already etched into my mind like a death sentence. The smell of ozone from the overworked printer filled the cramped security room, mixing with the metallic taste of adrenaline and bile at the back of my throat. My pulse thudded in my ears as Daniel slid the printed financial records across the desk, revealing the anomalies Victor had mentioned with a low, dangerous whisper. I stared at the transaction history, tracing a repetitive outflow of $35,000 every single month for the last 2 years. I cross-referenced the recipient, Linda Crawford Realty Consulting, LLC. The realization that my own sister-in-law had been siphoning my father's hard-earned money under the guise of consulting sent a fresh wave of nausea through me. This wasn't just a sudden heist. It was a slow, calculated bleed that I had unknowingly facilitated with my own trust. I discovered that these consulting fees paid to Linda were actually used to pay for Margaret's high-end wardrobe and designer handbags, which she had hidden in the very storage unit I thought held my engineering blueprints and legacy bridge designs. 35,000, I muttered, my fingers trembling against the grit of the paper. Every month. Daniel, look at the dates. He leaned in, his eyes scanning the columns. "They coincide exactly with your wife's dialysis treatments, sir. Each time I had sat in those sterile waiting rooms praying for a miracle, they were celebrating a successful withdrawal. Have you ever looked at a bank statement and realized you were paying for the rope someone was using to hang you? The steady, rhythmic blinking of the server lights felt like a countdown I couldn't stop. Digging deeper into the secondary account logs, Samuel Torres pinged my cell with a new find. A recurring payment of $4,800 for a corporate rental in the Northside waterfront district. Flashed on the screen Daniel mirrored for me. I checked the leaseholder and found my daughter Claire's name listed as the secondary occupant. "Aloft, Samuel," I asked into the speakerphone, my voice sounding like it was being dragged over gravel. "I've been living in a house full of hospital beds and oxygen tanks." While they were living at the pier, Samuel's voice came through with a clinical coldness. "The lease started the same month you quit your job, Mitchell." It was a humiliating epiphany. I had destroyed my career as a senior bridge inspector to save a woman who was busy furnishing a luxury apartment on my dime. While I was worrying about the structural integrity of our finances, she was worrying about the view of the lake. Every cent was a stab in the back. Every decimal point was a lie. The air in the room felt thin, the electric tension mounting, as I realized the scale of the architecture of this betrayal. I had been the architect of my own prison, designing a life of sacrifice while they built a world of excess. My fingertips left smudges of ink on the records of my own ruin. I flipped to the penultimate page, searching for the source of the man sitting in the VIP suite with my face. I found it. A line item for special effects artistry, a $12,000 payment to a theatrical makeup studio. It confirmed my worst fear: the imposter's transformation was professionally commissioned and paid for by my own household account. I had literally funded the creation of the man who was currently stealing my soul. The irony was a jagged blade in my chest. I felt my shattered trust turning into a focused, icy vengeance. I wasn't just a victim anymore. I was an engineer looking at a faulty design, and I knew exactly where to apply the pressure to make it all come down. My eyes locked onto the final line of the report, a one-way wire transfer to an account in Belize, scheduled for midnight tonight. I leaned so close to the monitor that the pixels blurred into a jagged mosaic of the man who had stolen my face. The sound of my own teeth grinding was the only thing I could hear over the low, persistent whir of overheated server fans. My eyes were fixed on the Belize transfer data. But the sound of Samuel's voice cracking through the speaker brought a new, sharper terror into the cramped security room. He had finally found the identity of the phantom. Samuel pings a dossier to the security room tablet, and the blue-white glare of the screen feels like a physical blow. "His name is Ryan Blackwood." Samuel's voice rasps through the intercom. "He is a 45-year-old former Hollywood stuntman with a chameleonic face and a penchant for high-stakes debt. He specialized in deep-tissue prosthetic work and physical mimicry before his career went into the gutter." I stared at the before photos, a man with sharp, desperate eyes and dark hair, and compared them to the after version sitting in the bank's VIP suite. The stuntman had been aged 30 years, with terrifying precision, every wrinkle and liver spot a calculated masterpiece. "He's not just wearing my clothes, Samuel." I whispered, the cold, dry air of the room catching in my throat. "He's wearing my life." Then came the first twist that made my stomach heave. Samuel pulled up a frame from a DOT safety video I had filmed 10 years ago. There in the background, standing among the extras, was a younger Ryan Blackwood. Claire had been scouting for a double far longer than I ever suspected. She hadn't just stumbled upon this plan. She had been architecting it for a decade. A stuntman. My life was being played by a man who made a living falling for other people. Samuel continued, his voice heavy with the data he was unearthing. Blackwood wasn't just some random actor. He was drowning in $280,000 of underground gambling debt to a syndicate in Atlantic City. He was a man with no exit strategy until Claire provided one. My heart stopped when Samuel displayed a series of private wire transfers from my daughter's personal travel blog account directly to Blackwood's creditors. Claire didn't just find him, did she? I asked, the words tasting like copper. She bought him. She cleared his slate, Mitchell Samuel confirmed. In exchange, he's clearing your bank accounts. It was a soul-crushing epiphany. It wasn't just a betrayal by a wife who pretended to be dying. It was a cold-blooded recruitment by a daughter who had essentially purchased a new father to sign her checks. How much does it cost to buy a daughter's love? Apparently, $280,000 and my father's name. I felt a nauseating violation as the architecture of the lie became fully visible. I was the bridge they had decided to demolish for the scrap metal. But Samuel wasn't finished. He uncovered a series of hidden folders in Blackwood's cloud storage that turned my icy rage into a paralyzing fire. It wasn't just Margaret and Ryan together in the photos. There were images of Ryan and Claire at the waterfront loft, laughing over wine, looking like a family. They were a couple living a life together in a penthouse I was unknowingly funding while I was home cleaning bed sores and measuring low-sodium chicken broth. I looked at the silver ring on Ryan's finger. My ring, the one I thought I'd lost down the sink drain a year ago, and realized he wasn't just impersonating me to the bank. He was playing the part in a bedroom I hadn't been allowed into for years. The man with my face wasn't just stealing my money. He was living the life I thought I had, while I was relegated to the role of the invisible caretaker in a house built on sand. The sound of my own footsteps echoed in the empty hallway of the bank as I ran toward the parking lot, driven by a need to reclaim the physical proof hidden in my own home. I left the bank behind the cool evening air of Chicago biting at my skin, but I barely felt it. My mind was a structural diagram of failure, tracing the lines of a life that had been compromised at the foundation. Stepping back into my house was like entering a mausoleum I'd spent 7 years decorating with lies and fake prescriptions. The familiar smell of stale lavender and floor wax greeted me, a scent that used to mean safety, but now felt like the chemical signature of a fraud. I stood in the entryway listening to the silence. Usually this house was filled with the artificial hum of a dialysis mimicking machine I'd purchased to keep Margaret comfortable, but with her away at the bank, the machine was dark. It was eerily quiet, the kind of stillness that precedes a total collapse. I walked into the living room, my eyes landing on a framed photo of my daughter Claire. Her smile seemed to mock me from the mantel. "Welcome home, Mitch," I whispered to the empty air. To the house built on quicksand. 7 years of my life had been poured into this place, and I had never even smelled the rot beneath the floorboards. I moved toward the coat closet to hang my jacket, but my hand stopped on the handle. Something was out of alignment. I pulled the door open and shoved aside the heavy winter coats. There, tucked into the far corner, sat a set of expensive hard-shell luggage I didn't recognize. I unzipped the smallest one. It wasn't packed with medical supplies or spare catheters for a hospital stay. It was filled with vibrant summer dresses, silk sarongs, and high SPF sunblock. They were prepared for a tropical climate, not a renal ward. Memory is a bridge with rusted rivets. Once you see the first crack, the whole structure begins to scream. A framed wedding invitation on the hallway wall caught the late afternoon light, triggering a visceral memory of Claire's wedding 5 years ago. I remembered sitting in the darkened master bedroom on that sweltering July day, holding Margaret's hand through what she claimed was a chronic flare-up of her kidney pain. "You should go, Mitch," she had groaned, her face twisted in a performance I'd found heroic at the time. "Don't let my kidneys ruin her big day." I'd refused to leave her side, believing my devotion was the only thing holding her together. I sat in the dark for 6 hours, while Claire's social media feed showed a lavish ceremony at a lakeside estate, a party I wasn't invited to. I realized now that Margaret's illness that day wasn't a tragedy. It was a tactical maneuver. She stayed home to keep me away from the guests who might have recognized Ryan Blackwood standing among the bridal party. I wasn't being a hero. I was being a jailer for my own replacement. The humiliation tasted like copper in my mouth. I turned toward the hallway closet and pulled the cord for the attic stairs. They unfolded like old bones, the wooden joints groaning under the strain. The attic stairs groaned. A warning from a house that didn't want its secrets found. I climbed into the unventilated space, the heavy dry heat pressing against my chest. I swept my flashlight across the dusty rafters until I found a rolled-up set of architectural blueprints for the house. I spread them out on an old trunk. They were my original designs, but they had been modified in Claire's unmistakable sharp handwriting. She had highlighted specific sections of the floor plan, labeled as dead zones areas, where she knew the acoustics of the house would prevent me from hearing conversations or where sightlines were obscured. She had mapped my own home against me. My flashlight beam hit a dust-covered briefcase in the far corner, hidden behind a stack of holiday decorations. Inside, Claire's old laptop sat nestled in foam, still plugged into a secret outlet installed behind the junction box. Its power light was blinking with a rhythmic green heartbeat in the dark, waiting for me to find the digital legacy of my own ruin. The screen flickered to life, its cold blue glow illuminating the dust motes and the deep weathered cracks in my hands, like a topographical map of a wasted life. I sat on the dusty attic floor, the dry, suffocating heat of the insulation pressing in on me from all sides. My breath hitched as the login screen appeared, a blank field demanding a key I shouldn't have possessed. I tried the most obvious combination, a sequence of 4 digits that felt like a mockery of my own existence. 0514. My own birthday. She used the day I was born to bury me. The desktop appeared cluttered with innocent-looking folders for travel photos and blog drafts, but my eyes were drawn to a hidden partition disguised as a travel archive. I navigated the directory with the frantic clicking of the trackpad, my pulse thudding in my throat. Inside, I found a folder named Operation Legacy. It was structured with the same engineering precision I once used to design state bridges, but this time the goal was to collapse a man's future. I discovered that Claire had a remote access app installed on my own phone for years. A digital tether that allowed her to delete bank alerts, freeze notifications, and erase hospital confirmation emails before they ever blinked on my screen. I was a senior inspector who could spot a hairline fracture in a steel girder from 50 yards away, yet I had been blind to the parasite living in my own pocket. "This isn't just a folder," I whispered into the stifling darkness. "It's a demolition plan." My fingers moved of their own accord, scrolling through a document that outlined a 7-phase conspiracy. Phase 1 was titled The Sick Bed Constraint. It detailed how Claire had recruited a disgraced medical student named Dr. Harrison to provide high-dose sedatives that perfectly mimicked the lethargy and nausea of kidney fatigue. I read Claire's typed status updates with a sour taste of realization blooming in my mouth. She wrote about how my pathetic devotion made the sedation easy to administer, how I was too distracted by my own nobility to ever check the pill bottles. "Do you know how it feels to realize the medicine you lovingly brought to your wife's bedside was the very poison keeping you a prisoner every time I had adjusted her pillows or stroked her hair? I was merely serving as an unwitting accomplice to my own kidnapping." Phase 2 involved the wait for legacy, a cold-blooded tracking of my father's declining health. They were vultures waiting for a $6.8 million inheritance to drop, and they had been circling for 7 years. Placebos. Lies. 7 years of my life distilled into a digital spreadsheet. The deeper I went, the more the betrayal transformed from a sharp pain into a cold, industrial rage. I found a spreadsheet labeled Sedative Schedule that finally broke the last tether of my denial. In the margins were scanned notes in Margaret's own delicate handwriting. She wasn't just a passive victim being drugged by her daughter. She was an active participant. She had been choosing exactly when to take the pills to trigger flare-ups whenever I mentioned a site inspection or a weekend trip. She used her own body as a tactical weapon to keep me within arm's reach of the lie. The humiliation was absolute, a structural failure so complete that no amount of reinforcement could ever fix it. I felt the sweat dripping down my neck, the air in the attic becoming unbreathable as the weight of the truth settled on my shoulders. I scrolled to the very bottom of the file and froze. There was a high-resolution photo of a man I didn't recognize standing in a sterile office next to Dr. Harrison. He was the man who had been providing the chemical chains for my cage, the technician of my misery. I stared at the photo, my mind already cataloging the face for the reckoning that was coming. There is a specific kind of soul sickness that comes from watching a stranger practice being you, coached by the woman who promised to love you until death. The cursor hovered over a folder named Mimicry Tutorials, and my finger trembled as I clicked play. The blue, flickering light of the laptop in the dark attic cast long, distorted shadows against the rafters, making the space feel like a witness to a crime. The video was high definition, recorded in the very waterfront loft I had unknowingly funded. In the frame, Ryan Blackwood sat at a desk hunched over a tablet. Margaret was right beside him, her face vibrant and healthy, devoid of the sickly pallor she wore at our dinner table. I watched as Ryan practiced my specific engineering signature hundreds of times. "No!" Margaret's voice came through the speakers, sharp and instructive. Mitchell pauses before the P. He hesitates like he is checking a weld. It is a tic he developed after that bridge failure in '98. I felt a nauseating violation crawling up my spine. She had cataloged my traumas like design specifications. I noticed a video time-stamped from a month ago where she coached him on public interactions. "If the teller asks too many questions, just let me handle it," she said with a dismissive wave. "We will tell people Mitchell has early-onset vocal fatigue from his stress. He is so predictable it is almost boring to play him." Ryan replied, pushing his glasses up his nose in a way that was a perfect mirror of my own habit. Click. Rewind. The sound of my wife's laughter felt like a serrated blade against my ears. I sat in the dry heat of the attic for a long time after the screen went black. The sound of the video's looped playback still echoing in the silence. My life had been a masterclass in deception, and I had been the only student who didn't know the curriculum. I finally closed the laptop, the green standby light blinking like a heartbeat in the dark, and retreated from the attic. I moved through the hallway past the room where I had spent years fetching water and fluffing pillows, and entered the master bathroom. I didn't turn on the lights at first. I let the moonlight spill in through the frosted window, illuminating the sharp, synthetic smell of Margaret's expensive perfumes that still lingered in the air. I stood before the cold, smooth surface of the bathroom mirror and finally flipped the switch. I looked at the man in the glass. For 7 years, I had allowed myself to become the caregiver, the worried husband, the man with the caregiver's slouch. Have you ever looked in a mirror and realized you've been a ghost in your own hallway? I began to consciously strip away that identity. I straightened my shoulders with the rigid discipline of a bridge inspector, assessing a primary load-bearing member. I cleared the exhaustion from my eyes, replacing it with the cold, industrial gaze that used to make junior engineers tremble. "You practiced the shell, Margaret," I whispered to her reflection in my mind. "You didn't account for the foundation. You can mimic the hitch in my shoulder, but you can't mimic the iron." I realized that while they had stolen my clothes and my ring, they had never possessed my iron-willed integrity. I am Mitchell Pierce, and tomorrow I am bringing this whole bridge down. As I reached up to splash cold water on my face, a glint caught the light. On the monitor earlier, Ryan had been wearing a specific watch. It wasn't a replica. It was my actual DOT commemorative watch, the one with the engraved steel casing I thought I had lost in a hospital cafeteria 3 years ago. She hadn't just replaced me. She had been harvesting my life piece by piece for years. I gripped the edge of the porcelain sink until my knuckles turned white, the weak man vanishing as a cold industrial rage took his place. The headlights of my truck sliced through the thick Chicago fog, a twin beam of truth, cutting toward the woman who had helped gut my life for $35,000 a month. My knuckles were still white on the steering wheel. the engine's growl vibrating through my chest as I pulled into the gated entrance of the Gold Coast. I was no longer the soft, grieving husband who fetched pillows and brewed herbal tea. That man had died in front of a bathroom mirror an hour ago. I was an inspector now looking for the stress points in a crooked bridge. I arrived at Linda Crawford's luxury condo at exactly 11 p.m. Linda Crawford, 56, adjusted her professional blazer nervously as she opened the door, her hands shaking as I pushed past her without waiting for an invitation. She tried to feign a sleepy surprise, but the smell of expensive, clinical air freshener and the way her eyes darted toward her laptop on the counter told me she had been waiting for a signal that never came. I marched to her designer glass coffee table and spread the forensic bank audits across the surface. The white pages glared under her recessed lighting, sharp and clinical. "You sell houses, Linda," I said, my voice as cold as a Lake Michigan winter. "Since when did you become a medical consultant for my wife's kidneys?" I watched the blood drain from her face as I pointed to the recurring payments from my father's legacy trust to her shell company. "Mitchell, I was just trying to help her." She stammered, her voice thin. "She said you were tracking every penny. She was scared she wouldn't have enough for the specialty care." I leaned over the table, my shadow swallowing her. Linda revealed that she was the one who actually found Dr. Harrison, but she claimed she believed he was a holistic specialist, not a disgraced medical student providing high-dose sedatives to keep me in a chemical fog. How much is a sister's loyalty worth? Apparently it's exactly $25,000 a month, plus a view of the lake. I stared at her, the silence in the room heavy with the distant muffled sound of waves against the seawall. "I'm an engineer, Linda. I know when a structure is about to fail. Right now, you're the weakest rivet in this conspiracy." I explained the reality of Operation Legacy, watching her eyes widen as she realized that the $850,000 she helped move made her a co-conspirator in federal wire fraud. I wasn't there to hear her excuses. I was there to break her. "You have two paths," I said, leaning in so close I could see the sweat beads on her forehead. "You can face the FBI tomorrow morning as a lead accomplice, or you can sign this affidavit now and help me bring down Claire and Margaret." I laid out the legal document, the cold, sharp corners of the printed statements pressing against my palms. Linda looked at the door, then back at the evidence. "They told me it was just a way to get her what she deserved," she whispered, reaching for a pen. "I didn't know about him. The actor." The pen scratched against the paper, the sound of a traitor choosing survival over family. As she signed, her resolve finally crumbled. "Claire had been recording your sleep-talking sessions for months. Mitchell," she confessed, her voice barely audible. "She used the recordings to give that man Ryan your exact cadence. Every private memory you mumbled in the dark was fed to him so he could pass as you in the high-stakes bank interviews. He knows things only you should know, because you told him while you were drugged." My stomach turned a visceral reaction to the idea of my own subconscious being harvested for a heist. I snatched the signed affidavit, the ink still fresh. Just as the ink on Linda's signature began to dry, my phone buzzed in my pocket, an unknown number from a New York area code I hadn't seen in years. I stared at the screen, the digits glowing like a neon sign in the dark of the condo, pulling me toward a ghost from my own past. The blue light of my phone screen pulsed in the dark cab of my truck, like a digital heartbeat displaying a New York area code that had been a ghost in my life for 9 years. I stared at the screen, the New York digits glowing like a neon sign in the damp Chicago night, as I pulled away from the curb outside Linda's condo. My hand trembled as I swiped to answer the cold condensation on the windshield, blurring the streetlights into weeping halos. I pressed the phone to my ear, listening to the static hiss of a long-distance connection that felt as vast as the Atlantic. "Dad," the voice came through, shaky and deep. "It's Ethan. Please don't hang up." Ethan Pierce, my 34-year-old son, with a voice that still carried the gentle cadence of his grandfather, sounded like a man waking up from a decade-long nightmare. I couldn't speak for a moment, the heavy aching pressure in my chest making it hard to find air. "Ethan," I finally whispered. "I haven't heard your voice since you were 25. He told me he had seen a frantic, vague social media post by Linda Crawford about me being at her door with bank records, and he couldn't stay silent anymore. The architecture of the lie Claire had built began to crumble right there in the front seat. Ethan revealed that Claire had been sending him monthly allowance checks from an anonymous trust for the last 3 years. I recognized the amount immediately. It was siphoned directly from my father's legacy, my own inheritance being used to buy my son's distance. "She used my money to keep you quiet, Ethan. She used my father's hard work to pay for your exile. How do you bridge a 9-year gap in a 10-minute phone call while your world is on fire?" The hazard lights clicked rhythmically, a metronome for the years we'd lost. Ethan's confession became even more devastating as he described an email he had received 6 months ago. It was from Claire, but clearly intended for the imposter Ryan Blackwood. It contained a draft of Phase 5 of something called Operation Legacy. Ethan admitted he had been too cowardly to reach out, then assuming it was a dark, creative writing project or a sick prank. He had spent years believing Claire's lies, that I was the one who had cut him off, that I was a bitter, weak man who didn't want him in my life. I thought it was a joke, Dad, a script for one of her luxury travel videos. I didn't think she was actually erasing you. He sounded smaller now, the distance between us closing with every word of regret. "She told everyone I was the one who cut you off, Ethan. She told me you hated the man I'd become." The silence on the line wasn't empty. It was full of the years we'd lost to a monster's design. We sat there, father and son, connected by a thread of fiber optics and shared trauma. But Ethan's voice sharpened the grief, turning into a warning. He mentioned that in the misdirected email, Claire had bragged about having a second notary on standby, a personal friend who would sign anything for a price. My heart sank. The injunction Victor was filing at Silverstone Trust wouldn't be enough if they moved the meeting to a private location or a different branch. The law was a bridge, but Claire was building a tunnel underneath it. "I'm coming home, Dad," Ethan said, his voice firming with a sudden, desperate resolve. "I have the email. I have the check stubs. And I have something else, something Claire said about a Phase 7 that you haven't found yet." I gripped the steering wheel, the leather cold under my palm. I wasn't alone anymore. The isolation Claire had engineered for 7 years had finally suffered a structural failure. The Chicago wind howled through the steel girders of the L train tracks, a mournful industrial scream that matched the cold clarity settling into my bones at 6 a.m. The first gray light of a Chicago dawn began to bleed through the fog. As I pulled into the staging area, my mind racing through the implications of Ethan's warning about Phase 7. I sat in a nondescript silver sedan, parked a block away from Silverstone Trust, the engine ticking as it cooled. Beside me sat Detective Morris, a 45-year-old veteran of the Financial Crimes Division, with tired eyes and a jaw that looked like it was carved from Illinois granite, who checked the signal on my wire. Victor Hayes sat in the back, his face a mask of legal grimness as he reviewed the finalized affidavit from Linda Crawford. Linda herself sat pale and silent in a separate police vehicle 10 yards behind us, her role as the weakest rivet finally serving a purpose. Morris adjusted the volume on the surveillance receiver, the static crackle of the earpiece a constant reminder of the stakes. He told me that they had tracked Dr. Harrison overnight. The man wasn't just a disgraced student, but a childhood friend of Ryan Blackwood. It proved the conspiracy had roots in Ryan's desperate past, long before he ever met my daughter. "You're wired," Mitchell Morris said, his voice low and steady. "Every word in that room is a nail in their coffin." I nodded, watching the diesel fumes from a passing bus swirl against the windshield. "I've built bridges that stood for 50 years, Detective. I'm not letting this one collapse before I get my pound of flesh." We waited in the biting cold of the morning air, the city waking up around us with an indifference that felt surreal. Have you ever stood in the shadows and watched a ghost steal your morning coffee, your suit, and your wife's loyalty all at once? At 8:45 a.m., the green BMW X5 pulled into the VIP lot. I raised the high-powered binoculars, my breath hitching, as I saw the man step out of the driver's side. Ryan Blackwood was wearing my favorite charcoal suit, the one I had tailored for my father's funeral. His wig was so precise, the silvering at the temples so exact, that it made my skin crawl with a visceral sense of violation. Margaret followed him out, her performed weakness perfectly choreographed. She leaned heavily on Ryan's arm, playing the role of the frail, dying victim for the security cameras. A moment later, Claire pulled up in a separate rideshare, stepping out with a mask of boardroom-ready ambition. "Look at him," I whispered, my teeth grinding. "He even mimics the way I favor my left knee when it rains." Victor reached forward, his hand heavy on my shoulder. "Don't let the anger break your rhythm, Mitchell. Stay behind the curtain until I give the signal." I watched through the lenses as they approached the glass doors, the metallic click of the bank's electronic locks echoing in my mind. Then I saw it. As Margaret adjusted her wrap, the medical alert bracelet I had bought her was gone. In its place was a diamond-encrusted watch that shimmered in the morning light. My mother's watch, the piece I was told had been lost during the estate probate. The lie wasn't just in their words. It was draped over their skin. 9 o'clock. The tumblers turned. The cage door opened. The conspirators disappeared into the lobby, and the air in the sedan suddenly felt too thin to breathe. Morris gave me a sharp nod, the final confirmation that the federal agents were in position on the internal servers. I adjusted the microphone hidden beneath my stiff collar, feeling the cold weight of the industrial rage finally finding its outlet. I looked at Victor, stepped out into the freezing wind, and walked toward the bank. I entered the sterile lobby just as the notary inside conference room A raised her seal for the final signature, the shadow of the man I used to be falling across the glass. The silence inside the bank was absolute, a heavy air-conditioned weight that smelled of floor wax and impending ruin as I approached the door to conference room A. The glass door to conference room A didn't just slide open. It felt like the seal of a 7-year-old tomb finally cracking under the weight of the truth. I stepped into the room, the clinical ozone scent of the air conditioning hitting me like a physical barrier. Flanked by Victor Hayes and with Detective Morris trailing at a strategic distance, I halted 3 feet from the mahogany table. I didn't look at the bank manager or the paperwork. I stared directly into the eyes of the man wearing my face, my favorite charcoal suit, and my mother's diamond watch. "I believe you're holding a pen that belongs to me," I said, my voice steady and cold as a winter morning in Chicago. The sharp, metallic click of the notary's seal hitting the desk was the only response. The notary looked up, her hand frozen mid-air, while Margaret's face transformed into a mask of calculated confusion. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice trembling with a practiced frailty. "Mitchell, who is this man?" I let the silence hang heavy and industrial. Before I entered conference room A, I stopped at the lobby kiosk. The screen demanded dual authentication. I pressed my thumb to the scanner match, confirmed. Then I pulled out my engineering seal, the one Ryan could never possess, and pressed it into the verification plate. The system chimed, "Primary authority verified. Poison pill clause deactivated." Through the glass, I saw Ryan staring at his screen. Red warnings flashed. Authorization denied. Seal required. The papers Ryan was preparing to sign were currently nothing more than expensive, legally worthless litter. He looked like me. He smelled like my cologne, but his soul was a hollowed-out construction site. I watched Ryan Blackwood's knuckles turn white as he gripped the desk, his eyes searching mine for a weakness he hadn't been coached to find. "Nice suit, Ryan," I said, letting a predatory smile touch my lips. "But you forgot that a bridge inspector never misses the small cracks in the foundation." I noted the way his vocal cadence was just a fraction off a slight lag that spoke of rehearsals rather than reality. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the printed dossier Samuel had compiled. I dropped the stuntman's history and the detailed records of his $280,000 gambling debt onto the glass table. The morning sun reflected off the surface blindingly bright as the documents fanned out like a losing hand in a high-stakes game. "This is a mistake." Ryan stammered, his calculated composure beginning to collapse into the raw, desperate twitching of a cornered animal. "Mitchell, tell them," he cried out, looking toward Margaret, but she was staring at the dossier with wide, uncomprehending eyes. "Have you ever stared at your own reflection and realized the glass was actually a two-way mirror for a thief? I wasn't done with the exposure." I turned my gaze to the notary, who was slowly sliding her chair back toward the door. "I wouldn't do that, Sarah Vane," I said, using her full name. "I know all about your friendship with Claire. I know about the emails where she promised you a cut of the Belize transfer for your services today." Sarah's face turned the color of ash, and she froze, trapped in the room by the very conspiracy she had hoped would set her up for life. I saw the sweat darkening the collar of Ryan's suit, the fabric I had worn to my own father's funeral. The violation felt physical, a structural rot that had finally been brought into the light. The room was a cage now, and the locks were entirely in my control. I leaned over the conference table, my shadow falling across Ryan's trembling hands, and watched the realization of his total failure settle into his eyes. I leaned in closer until I could see the silicone seams behind his ears and whispered his real name just as Detective Morris's hand went to his holster. "You're done, Ryan. The show is over." The door clicked shut behind Detective Morris, locking the conspirators inside the very cage they had built for me, as Margaret finally broke her silence. Her voice was a ragged sob, but before she could anchor her plea in the room, the heavy oak doors were flung wide by my daughter Claire, who marched in with the practiced confidence of a woman who thought she'd already won the world. The click of Claire's high heels on the marble floor sounded like the cocking of a hammer. She was radiant, her face flushed with the expectation of a multi-million-dollar victory. Her scent, a cloying, expensive perfume flooding the sterile air of the conference room. She didn't see me at first. She was looking at Ryan at the documents at the finish line. Then her gaze shifted. I watched the smug victory on her face dissolve, but not into panic. It morphed into a sharp, clinical curiosity. She took in the room, the detective, and finally me standing tall with my jaw set. "Well, look at that," she said, her voice smooth and devoid of heat. The bridge inspector finally found a crack in the foundation. "Is that all you have to say to the father you tried to erase, Claire?" I asked, my voice vibrating with a coldness that surprised even me. She didn't answer. Instead, she adjusted her designer bag on her shoulder, looking at me with a dead, flat look in her eyes that I finally recognized as pure calculation. Claire had been secretly draining Margaret's side accounts for months, siphoning the small fortunes I thought were going to medical bills into her own offshore holdings. She wasn't just stealing from me. She was gutting her mother as she went. She wasn't my daughter anymore. She was a structural failure I couldn't repair. I moved toward the table, dropping a secondary folder of data I'd pulled from the Operation Legacy file. "Margaret," I said, looking at my wife as she huddled in her chair, "you might want to see the itinerary for Phase 6. I watched Margaret's eyes scan the page, a single one-way ticket to Belize in Claire's name. There was no second ticket. Claire had intended to let Margaret take the full legal fall for the identity theft, while she vanished with the bulk of the $6.8 million. Margaret looked up at Claire, her face a mask of shattered disbelief. "Claire, you weren't going to leave me." Claire finally laughed, a hollow, terrifying sound that rattled the pens on the table. "Mom was always a better actress than a thinker," she said, showing a chilling intellectual contempt. She actually believed the stuntman loved her. She actually believed she was the one in charge. Have you ever looked into your own child's eyes and seen nothing but a calculation? I felt a hollow ache where my heart used to be. "You're a monster, Claire," I whispered. "A perfect engineered monster." She shrugged as if I'd complimented the cut of her blazer. "I preferred to think of myself as an opportunist," she replied. "Both of you were obsolete assets. You were just waiting to be liquidated." The room fell into a suffocating silence as the gravity of her betrayal settled over Margaret like a shroud. Detective Morris stepped forward, the sharp metallic snap of the handcuffs echoing through the room. Claire didn't struggle. She didn't cry. She simply stood there. As her wrists were bound, her composure as rigid as the steel I used to inspect. As they began to lead her out, she paused beside me. She leaned in, her cloying perfume thick in my nostrils, and whispered so only I could hear. "I never hated you, Mitchell. I just found your nobility to be a profitable weakness I couldn't resist exploiting." Claire didn't cry. She didn't scream. She simply looked at the handcuffs, then at me, and offered a small, terrifying smile that told me this was far from over. I stood in the wreckage of my family watching them lead my daughter away, realizing that the bridge I had spent 30 years protecting had never even been there. The walk back to my truck felt like a journey through a wasteland where the rubble was made of my own memories, and the front door of my house looked like the entrance to a crime scene I'd been living in for 7 years. I stood on the porch of the Elmwood residence, my keys heavy in my hand. Ethan stood beside me, his presence a quiet, steady anchor in a world that had lost its gravity. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, greeted by the familiar scent of expensive floor wax and the clinical tang of medical supplies. It used to smell like duty and devotion. Now it just smelled like the bottom of a grave. I walked through the main hallway, seeing the ghost of the man who used to meticulously organize Margaret's fake treatments. Every corner of this house was a witness to my humiliation. "It's so quiet." Dad Ethan whispered, his voice echoing in the hollow space. "It's like the house itself was holding its breath while they lied to you." "It's not quiet, Ethan," I replied, my voice sounding flat and tired. "It's empty. It was always empty. I just didn't have the eyes to see it." Underneath the mattress of the very bed where I had spent years fluffing pillows, I found a hidden journal. It wasn't a diary of pain. It was a ledger of mockery. Margaret had been rating my caretaking performance, scribbling biting notes about how easy it was to manipulate my salt intake obsessions while she was secretly ordering lobster to the waterfront loft. I felt a profound, hollow exhaustion as I realized my life's work had been her private comedy. Crash. The dialysis machine hit the floor. Plastic and glass shattered. It sounded like the truth. I began tearing down the medical apparatus with a frantic industrial precision. I ripped the tubes from the fake machine and swept the rows of kidney medication bottles into a heavy-duty black plastic trash bag. The crinkle of the plastic was the only song I wanted to hear. Ethan helped me, the two of us working in a rhythmic, somber silence that served as our first shared act of father-son bonding in nearly a decade. While clearing a panel in the sick room, I found a hidden stash of Jimmy Choo designer shoes tucked behind her oxygen tank. I was eating tuna out of a can for months so we could afford her specialists. I said, staring at a pair of 4-inch heels that had cost more than my first truck. "Don't look at the shoes," Dad Ethan said, placing a firm hand on my shoulder. "Look at the trash bag. It's all going where it belongs." Have you ever cleaned out a room and realized the only thing you were actually throwing away was your own misplaced mercy? I carried the bags through the house, the smell of dust and stagnant air following me like a persistent ghost. I reached the kitchen island where the last tray of pills I prepared this morning sat waiting. I remembered the tenderness with which I used to hand her the water glass, the way I'd watch her throat move as she swallowed her lies. I picked up the tray and walked out to the driveway. The cold, biting Chicago wind whipped at my face, but I didn't flinch. I stood by the large bin and dumped the colorful placebos into the waste, watching them rattle against the bottom and disappear under the real debris of my broken marriage. The engineering mind in me finally checked the demolition box. The structure was down. There were no survivors in the wreckage of my trust. As I cleared out the last of the bedside table, my hand hit a false back. I pulled out a legal document Margaret had been trying to get me to sign in my sleep. It was a do not resuscitate order for myself, professionally drafted, to ensure she would inherit my remaining assets the second my heart stopped, under the weight of the stress she'd created. I held the trash bag tight, the weight of it pulling at my shoulders, but my eyes were already on the calendar. The trial was 3 months away, and I knew Margaret was only the first bridge I had to burn. December brought a Chicago winter that turned the lake to iron and my heart to stone, providing the perfect frozen clarity needed to dissect the remains of my stolen decade. I sat in Victor's high-rise office watching the city disappear behind a white curtain of a mid-afternoon snowstorm. The muffled silence of the storm outside was a stark contrast to the sharp metallic smell of the heater ticking over in the corner. I had spent the last 3 months living like a monk in the ruins of my home, but today was about the numbers. Victor Hayes sat across from me, his face illuminated by the harsh brightness of the white audit pages splayed out under LED lights. He didn't look like a lawyer anymore. He looked like a coroner performing an autopsy on my bank account. The forensic audit was finally complete, and it was far more sinister than a simple case of identity theft. Victor revealed that Claire had been paying for life insurance on me for 5 years, but the beneficiary wasn't my wife or my estate. It was a shell corporation owned solely by Ryan Blackwood. They hadn't just been waiting for my father's money. They had been betting on my expiration date. It's more than just theft. Mitchell Victor set his voice flat as he pointed to a series of offshore transfers. It's an exit strategy. They weren't just stealing your money. They were erasing your existence. The consulting fees you were paying were actually a retirement fund for Claire and Ryan to use in Belize. Margaret was just the decoy they kept in the front window to keep you occupied. I leaned back, my eyes tracking the columns of figures. I was a bridge to them, something to walk over and leave behind once they reached the other side. The spreadsheets didn't lie. Numbers have a structural integrity that people lack. I had spent 30 years trusting the physics of steel, and now I was relearning the physics of betrayal. My life had been reduced to a ledger of debits, each one a day I'd spent fetching water for a woman who was actively planning my replacement. The audit then turned its cold eye to the chemical chains that had bound me. We traced the paper trail for the medications I had administered so faithfully every evening. There were no legitimate pharmacies, only monthly wire transfers to a nondescript mail-order facility in a remote part of Florida. Just as I was beginning to process the sheer scale of the medical gaslighting, the vibrating hum of Victor's phone on the glass desk broke the silence. He answered, listened for a moment with a tightening jaw, and then looked at me. The FBI just called. They got him. Harrison was apprehended in a sting operation in Miami. Harrison isn't a doctor, Mitchell. He's a professional jailer with a chemistry set. They found a ledger in his possession, other clients who used his services to incapacitate wealthy relatives, 7 years of poisoning my own wife. Because I trusted a piece of paper, I whispered the realization, feeling like a physical weight on my lungs. I had been the one holding the spoon, the one ensuring the dosage was correct, all based on a script written by a criminal. How do you quantify the cost of a decade spent in a drug-induced fog of someone else's making? I felt a grim validation, but it was hollow. The structure of my family was gone, replaced by a crime scene that spanned 3 states. Victor slid a final thin folder across the desk. It contained a transcript of Harrison's initial confession to the Miami field office. He told the agents that Margaret was actually the one who requested a higher dosage of sedatives for me 6 months ago. She told him I was becoming too unpredictable, too prone to asking questions about the banking alerts. She didn't just want me quiet. She wanted me under. I stared at a Phase 7 detail mentioned in the final paragraph of the confession. It made the hair on my arms stand up. I wasn't just being managed. I was being prepared for a final removal. The county courthouse in January felt like a meat locker, a fitting place to decide which parts of my family were dead and which were merely rotting. I walked through the double doors, the smell of old paper and industrial floor cleaner clinging to the heavy, stagnant air. Every step I took on the linoleum seemed to echo with the finality of a structural collapse. I took my seat on the cold, uncomfortable hardness of a wooden gallery bench, my back straight, my expression an unreadable mask of iron. I watched Margaret enter the courtroom, and the sight of her sent a sharp, bitter wave of nausea through my chest. She was back to using her cane, the sharp, synthetic squeak of the rubber tip punctuating the silence of the room. She wore a drab, oversized wool sweater that made her look small and fragile, a carefully constructed costume designed to evoke pity. Her lawyer stood and began to weave a narrative of tragedy, arguing that my client was a puppet, Your Honor, tethered by her own daughter's sociopathic ambition. He spoke of psychological coercion and duress, painting Margaret as a victim who had been forced into the charade. I watched her from the gallery, seeing the way she cast tearful, longing glances toward me, as if pleading for a bridge of forgiveness I no longer possessed. I revealed my own countermeasure. Then a meticulous caregiver's log I had kept for 7 years, documenting every time she claimed to be in pain, which cross-referenced perfectly with the dates Claire had gone on shopping sprees in the city. The design of her lies was failing under the weight of my data. The cane was a prop. The tears were a special effect. I was done being the audience. I was called to the witness stand, and I felt the eyes of the room press against me like a load-bearing wall. Judge Sterling, a man with a face like a worn-out gavel, and eyes that had seen every trick in the book, peered over his spectacles at me. I didn't look at Margaret as I gave my statement. I spoke with the rigid steel of an inspector, recounting the signature practice videos and the sedative schedule we had recovered from the laptop. I refused to provide the character testimony her defense so desperately needed to reduce her charges. In my professional life, a bridge doesn't fall because of one bad rivet. It falls because the design was corrupt. From the start, I told the court, my voice calm and absolute. She wasn't coerced. She was the one holding the stopwatch. How do you offer mercy to the person who spent 7 years measuring the depth of your grave? I felt the last cable of our marriage snap in that open court, the tension finally leaving my shoulders as I spoke the truth. The defense attorney tried to rattle me, suggesting I was a bitter man looking for vengeance. But I simply looked at him with the same detachment I used for a hairline fracture in a steel girder. You don't get angry at a broken bridge. You just dismantle it so it doesn't hurt anyone else. The judge leaned back, the heavy, rhythmic thud of his gavel silencing the room as he prepared to deliver his ruling. He revealed that Harrison's confession included a recording of Margaret laughing while she practiced her hospital cough for a bank interview, a piece of evidence that destroyed the duress defense instantly. I watched the color drain from Margaret's face, her fragile mask finally shattering. The judge hammered his gavel, the sound echoing like a structural snap, and looked at Margaret with a coldness that matched the Chicago wind outside. Motion denied. Trial set for February 10th. I stood up and walked out of the courtroom, not looking back, the sound of the Chicago wind howling against the glass as I prepared for the final demolition. 3 weeks later, Margaret suffered a massive stroke in her cell. She died before the ambulance arrived. Her last words were about the girl. I didn't attend the funeral. Ethan went alone, returning with a sealed envelope, Margaret's letter written months before, in case something happens. I buried her ashes beside my father, not out of love, but obligation. The woman I'd married died 7 years ago. This was just paperwork. The February sun was a pale, heatless disk, casting long, skeletal shadows across the courthouse steps as the trial that would officially dismantle my family began. I took my seat in the front row of Federal Courtroom 4B, the air inside smelling of floor wax and old wood, a scent that felt like the atmosphere of a sanctuary and a tomb combined. Ethan took his seat beside me, his shoulder brushing mine, and the warmth of his presence was the only thing keeping the chill of the morning from settling permanently into my marrow. I watched the federal prosecutor stand to deliver a scathing opening statement, framing the entire conspiracy not as a crime of passion, but as a cold engineering project. On large monitors, the 7-phase structural map of my own destruction was displayed for the jury, a blueprint of betrayal that made my father's $6.8 million legacy look like a target in a shooting gallery. I glanced at Ryan Blackwood, who sat slumped between his high-priced lawyers. Stripped of his Mitchell disguise, he looked like a discarded prop from a play that had been canceled mid-performance. There was no dignity left in him, just the hollowed-out remains of a man who had tried to wear my soul. They didn't just want his money. The prosecutor told the jury, her voice echoing in the dry, stale air. They wanted to delete his very existence. Look at the defendant. That isn't a face, it's a mask. I felt a grim satisfaction at her words, a somber clarity that finally labeled the horror I had lived through. Ethan was called to the stand shortly after. I watched with wet eyes as my son, once so distant and full of a bitterness I never understood, took a stand for the man they tried to bury. He revealed that Claire had once tried to convince him to sign a waiver stating, "I was mentally incompetent," intending to put me in a state-run facility permanently, so they could manage the estate without even the inconvenience of drugging me. The truth doesn't just set you free. It burns everything that was built on a lie. Ethan recounted the systematic isolation he faced, explaining how Claire's lies had convinced him I was a controlling, abusive man. He spoke of the allowance checks that were nothing more than hush money siphoned from my own inheritance. The rhythmic tapping of the court reporter's keys was the only sound in the room, as Ethan described the misdirected email that finally broke the spell. "I was a fool, Dad," he said, turning his gaze directly from the witness stand to mine. "I let them pay me to stay away while they poisoned you." His voice broke, and for a moment, the heavy silence of the courtroom was filled with the weight of 9 lost years. I am here to stand for my father. Have you ever seen your own child apologize for believing a monster over you? It's a bridge being rebuilt in real time, one rivet of trust at a time. I gripped the wooden armrest of my chair, my knuckles white, feeling the structural integrity of my life returning. As Ethan stepped down from the stand, he did something that wasn't on the witness list. He reached into his pocket and handed the prosecutor a small, silver-encrypted USB drive he had found hidden in his old New York apartment. He explained that Claire had stashed it there during a visit, likely as a secondary backup for her Belize exit strategy. It contained secret recordings of Ryan and Claire discussing their future plans. Plans that involved leaving Margaret behind to face the fallout. I felt the warmth of Ethan's hand as he returned to the gallery and gripped mine, our fingers interlocking for the first time in a decade. But my gaze was pulled to the side door. Margaret was being wheeled in for her testimony, her face a mask of calculated frailty. She wasn't looking at me. She was looking at that silver drive in the prosecutor's hand, and for the first time since the bank, I saw real terror in her eyes. The flashes of the paparazzi cameras outside were like lightning strikes, illuminating a shame I could no longer hide behind the clinical walls of my home. I gripped Ethan's hand as the court went into recess, the physical heat of his palm, the only thing grounding me as Margaret was wheeled past. She wouldn't look at me. Her eyes were fixed with a predatory intensity on the silver USB drive resting on the prosecutor's table. I felt the weight of her betrayal anew, a heavy air-conditioned pressure in my chest. As we pushed through the heavy courthouse doors for a momentary escape, the media firestorm hit us with the force of a structural collapse. The case had been dubbed the $6.8 million family fraud, and my private agony had become public entertainment. Headlines screamed about the stuntman double and the 7-year sickbed lie. I saw Claire's smug, high-resolution face on every newsstand, her smile as sharp as a jagged shard of glass. Victor pulled me aside, his face grim, as he showed me a report on his tablet. A major true crime network had already approached Claire's legal team for an exclusive interview. Even in handcuffs, my daughter was trying to profit from the demolition of my life. "They are treating my life like a reality show," Ethan, I said, the dry, papery smell of courtroom documents still clinging to my clothes. I looked at the crowd of reporters, their recorders held out like weapons. "Let them watch, Dad," Ethan replied, his voice firming with a strength I hadn't heard in a decade. "Let them see you win." Flash. Flash. Click. They weren't taking pictures. They were vultures circling the ruins of a man they thought was already dead. I retreated back into the courtroom, where the air was stale and heavy with the scent of old wood and impending finality. When the bailiff called my name for the victim impact testimony, I felt the rhythmic, heavy thud of my heart against my ribs. I walked toward the witness stand, the cold, unyielding wood feeling like the only honest thing left in the room. I didn't speak with the voice of a broken husband. I spoke with the cold, precise cadence of a senior bridge inspector, delivering a report on a fatal failure. I detailed the 2,555 days of false caretaking. I described every missed holiday and every anniversary spent sitting in the dark, holding the hand of a woman who was mentally counting my inheritance. I didn't just lose my money. I told the jury, my eyes scanning their 12 faces. I lost 7 years of oxygen to a lie. I was a man who lived for the structural integrity of things. Yet I had allowed the foundation of my own home to rot until it crumbled. Have you ever had to stand in front of 12 strangers and explain why you were a fool for love? It is a special kind of humiliation to admit that your nobility was nothing more than a blindfold. I turned my head slightly to look at Ryan Blackwood and Margaret. "You can practice my signature," I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "You can wear my clothes and steal my watch, but you can't mimic my soul." As I spoke, the prosecutor activated the display monitor. She was using stress analysis software to overlay Margaret's medical logs with her heart rate during the signatures. The jury watched in silence, as the graph showed Margaret stayed perfectly chillingly calm while she lied about her kidney failure. She wasn't a victim of stress. She was a predator in repose. I felt a surge of cathartic release as the engineering of their lie was stripped bare. I had delivered my final inspection, and the verdict of the wreckage was clear. As I stepped down from the stand, my legs felt heavy but stable. A court officer intercepted me, handing me a small folded note. He pointed toward the back row. My heart skipped a beat as I saw a woman sitting in the shadows of the gallery, a woman who looked exactly like the professional makeup artist Samuel had identified in his forensic report. The sentencing phase felt like the final rivets being driven into the coffin of my past life as I unfolded the note with trembling fingers. The note in my hand was warm, the ink slightly smudged by the palm of a woman who had spent years painting the faces of ghosts. As I read the elegant, hurried script, the air in the hallway seemed to thin. The woman was Sienna Blake, the makeup artist Samuel had flagged in his report. She hadn't come to gloat. She'd come to clear her conscience. The note revealed a chilling detail. Ryan Blackwood hadn't just asked her to make him look like me. In the earliest stages of their meetings, he'd brought in photos of my father requesting a likeness of a man 20 years older than I am. It was a terrifying revelation. This wasn't just a heist against me. They had been scouting for a way to infiltrate the legacy long before my father had even passed. I moved back into the courtroom, my mind spinning with the calculated cruelty of it. I took my seat as the judge called for order, his voice like a gavel striking iron. The sentencing hearing began with Ryan Blackwood. He sat there without the silicone masks or the tailored charcoal suit, just a man in a jumpsuit who had worn my life like a rented tuxedo. I watched as the judge meticulously dismantled Ryan's plea for leniency. He didn't care about the gambling debts or the stuntman's desperation. The judge labeled him a professional predator of the soul and sentenced him to 12 years in federal prison. Ryan tried to catch my eye for a final moment of pity, but I looked through him as if he were a pane of glass. "You didn't just steal money, mister," Blackwood the judge stated the words echoing in the dry courtroom air. You exploited the sanctity of a man's home. 12 years for the mask. 9 for the actress. The play was finally ending. Margaret was wheeled in next, her frailty no longer a performance, but a genuine consequence of her psychological collapse. The judge rejected her motherly devotion defense, citing the audio recordings of her mocking my trust. She was sentenced to 9 years a term, reduced only because the digital evidence proved Claire was the primary financial beneficiary. Mitchell. I'm so sorry, she whispered as the guards began to move her. Please tell Claire that I love her. I didn't respond. I couldn't. 9 years for a 7-year lie almost felt like an even trade, but the mathematics of the heart don't work that way. I watched the heavy metallic thud of the jail transport doors closing in my mind's eye. How do you rebuild a foundation when the people who poured the concrete were the ones who hid the dynamite? Later, I met Linda Crawford in a small probation office conference room. The smell of floor wax and stale coffee was overwhelming, and the pale fluorescent light cast long, weary shadows across the table. Linda, now a state witness, was signing over the remaining $650,000 from her shell company. The scratching sound of her pen on the legal restitution papers was the only sound in the room. I've transferred every cent back, Mitchell, she said, her voice barely a whisper. I'll be paying off the rest for the next decade. I watched her sign the final deed, providing the properties she'd helped Claire acquire under the table. I don't want your thanks, Linda, I said, my voice reflecting a weary pragmatism. I just want the ledger to be clean. She paused, her hand hovering over the paper, and looked at me with a sudden sharp intensity. She confessed that during her time consulting, Claire had asked her to scout for a small private landing strip in a remote part of Illinois. It wasn't about an airport. It was about a final escape route I hadn't even considered. I watched Linda walk out the door, but my mind was stuck on a single word in Sienna's note. A word that pointed to a hidden asset even Victor hadn't found in the audit. The courtroom for Claire's sentencing felt different, colder, sharper, and devoid of the fake tears that had stained the previous hearings, as if the law itself had sharpened its teeth for the mastermind. I stood at the back for a moment, observing my daughter as she was led to the defense table. She didn't look at me. She didn't look at Margaret, who sat huddled in her own silent misery. Claire stood before the judge with a rigid intellectual defiance, her chin tilted up, as if she were the only person in the room who understood the true value of the game. The prosecution characterized her as the architect of an emotional demolition, a woman who didn't just want wealth, but who took pleasure in the systematic erasure of her own father. 18 years for the mastermind, I whispered, as the judge delivered the sentence. You didn't just want my money, Claire. You wanted to erase my name. She finally turned to me as the guards gripped her arms. You think you've won, Dad? She shouted, her voice echoing in the stale air. You're still the same pathetic bridge inspector, just in a more expensive cage. I watched her go, realizing that the poison pill she had left behind was far more than just a legal clause. 18 years. A long time to sit in a cell and realize that your father's weakness was actually your own undoing. Months later, in September, I returned to the Elmwood District home for the final time. The stark brightness of the September sun hit the bare floorboards, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the empty space. The house was a shell. I walked through the quiet rooms, hearing the hollow echo of my own footsteps. I could still see the outlines on the carpet, where the medical equipment once stood, ghostly reminders of my 7-year imprisonment. It was a construction site for a heist, a structure I had maintained with the obsessive care of a man who thought he was saving a life. I discovered then that Claire had taken out a second mortgage on the house using a forged power of attorney. The sale proceeds would be significantly less than I anticipated, a final parting gift from a daughter who wanted to ensure my foundation remained unstable. Have you ever walked through your own house and realized you were the only real thing in a world made of cardboard and lies? I began to pack the last of my engineering blueprints, the only things from this place that held any structural integrity. A forgotten document slipped from the box, a faded brochure from Midwest Fertility and Surrogacy Center, dated 2018. Margaret and I had signed the contract 8 years ago, hoping for a second child after Ethan left. But then her kidney symptoms began, and I assumed the clinic had canceled everything. Now I understood Claire had intercepted the clinic's emails. She'd kept the surrogacy alive without my knowledge. I left the luxury furniture and the designer shoes behind for the liquidators. I wanted no part of the debris they represented. 7 years of maintenance on a structure that was rotten at the core. I muttered, sealing the final box. The smell of cardboard and dust was the scent of my liberation. The real estate agent met me in the kitchen, her heels clicking on the tile. The last signature that matters isn't for the trust, it's for the deed to this tomb, I said, reaching for the pen. As I signed the final page, she mentioned that the buyer was a trust linked to an anonymous group in North Carolina. It was the very state I had been considering for my relocation, a coincidence that felt like a sudden, unexpected shift in the wind. I set the pen down on the empty kitchen island, the same spot where I dropped the knife a year ago, and walked out without looking back. The cold, metallic click of the front door locking for the last time was the most satisfying sound I had heard in a decade. I reached my truck, ready to leave the Elmwood district forever, but the FBI agents were already waiting for me. They didn't smile. They looked like men who had found a leak in a dam that everyone thought was dry. Agent Miller held out a heavy manila folder. "We found a hidden asset, Mitchell, something Claire kept off the ledger." I stared at the folder, the weight of the final mystery pulling at my hands. The FBI agents didn't smile. They looked like men who had found a leak in a dam that everyone thought was dry as they opened the folder. The smell of the leather interior in my truck usually felt like sanctuary, but with Agent Miller leaning against the door, it felt like a gilded cage. Agent Miller stood there, his suit too expensive for a government salary, and his eyes too tired for a man in his 30s. He didn't offer a greeting. He simply forced me to stay by the truck, tossing a heavy manila folder onto the hood with a dull thud that echoed in the quiet afternoon. I thought I was done with signatures today. I muttered, my voice sounding thin even to my own ears. "This isn't a closing statement, Mitchell. It's an opening statement for a grand jury." Miller replied, his tone as flat as the asphalt. I looked down at the high-resolution photos spilling out of the folder. They were pictures of a hardware crypto wallet found in a safety deposit box I didn't even know existed. It was registered under a pseudonym I had used a decade ago for an engineering project in Dubai, a name I hadn't thought about in years. My heart hammered against my ribs, a rhythmic reminder of a past that refused to stay buried. I felt a sudden sharp spike of paranoia, a claustrophobia that had nothing to do with the open driveway. The FBI hadn't come for the house or the knife. They had been tracking a dormant digital ghost that had suddenly woken up the second I signed the sale papers. Silence. Not the peaceful kind. The kind that precedes a car crash. Miller gestured for me to get inside the truck. He climbed into the passenger seat, the smell of stale coffee on his breath filling the small space. He pulled out a tablet and began explaining the technical specs of the wallet. It wasn't just a storage device for currency. It was linked to a sophisticated dead man's switch. If a specific biometric check-in isn't met within the next 24 hours, the contents will be blasted to every major news outlet, and the SEC, Miller said, the blue glow of the tablet reflecting in his weary eyes. "We're talking about millions in laundered crypto and encrypted whistleblowing files that could level half the firms on the S&P 500. Who was the fail-safe for?" I asked, the realization of the stakes making my hands shake. "Not for you. For the person who wants you dead," Miller whispered. He showed me the countdown timer on the screen, the numbers bleeding away in a steady crimson march. It was a digital guillotine, and I was the only one whose neck was on the line. I leaned back against the headrest, my mind racing through the people I had trusted and the people I had failed. You ever feel like your life is a ghost story? I was starting to realize I wasn't the protagonist. I was the haunting. But Miller wasn't done. He revealed that the dead man's switch wasn't just a passive leak waiting to happen. The wallet was currently being accessed by a third party in real time. Someone was trying to disarm the switch from inside my own network, bypassing the encryption layers that should have been impenetrable. Miller turned the tablet toward me, showing a live map of the intrusion. The signal attempting to bypass the switch was coming from a device registered to my late wife. My blood turned to ice. Margaret was dead, her remains resting in a plot I had visited only a month ago. Yet on the screen, her digital footprint was as vibrant and aggressive as if she were sitting in the room with us. Miller looked at me, his eyes searching for a lie I didn't have the strength to tell. The ghost wasn't just in the machine. It was coming for the legacy. The asphalt blurred beneath the FBI sedan as Miller pushed 80 the siren silent, but the urgency screaming in the way he gripped the wheel. I sat in the passenger seat, my mind a jagged map of the locations Miller had shown me on the tablet. A year ago, I believed I'd buried the ghosts of my family, but today, the digital signal of a dead woman was leading me back into the heart of the wreckage. During the drive, Miller explained that Claire had been demanding to see me for weeks from her high-security cell. "She's been in a cage for a year," Mitchell Miller muttered, his eyes never leaving the road. "How does she have the reach to touch a hardware wallet in a sealed vault?" I leaned my head against the cold glass of the window, watching the gray Illinois horizon. "Maybe because she never really left the room," I replied, thinking of the way Claire's intellect always operated 3 steps ahead of anyone's perception. How do you outrun a woman who is already behind bars? You don't. You just wait for her to stop pulling the leash. We arrived at the state correctional facility, a brutalist monument of concrete and wire that looked like it was designed to swallow hope whole. Miller escorted me through a series of buzzing steel doors, the smell of industrial floor wax and stale air growing thicker with every step. I felt a profound sense of intellectual confusion. My wife was dead, yet she was hacking a $1 million failsafe. It was a bridge failure I couldn't calculate. Claire sat behind the reinforced glass, her orange jumpsuit, a violent contrast to the pale, waxy skin of a woman who hadn't seen the sun in 12 months. She looked gaunt, her eyes sharp and predatory, lacking even a shred of the remorse she'd feigned during her trial. "You look tired, Mitch," she said, her voice crackling through the cold plastic of the visitation phone. "Selling the house didn't set you free, did it?" I gripped the receiver until my knuckles turned white. "Did you like the gift I left in the Elmwood kitchen?" she asked, referring to the legal trap that nearly cost me everything. I didn't flinch. "The FBI thinks you're the one hacking the switch, Claire. Are you?" She leaned in her breath, fogging the glass. She revealed that the hardware wallet required 2 physical keys to stop the timer, and she had the second one hidden in plain sight. If you are still here with me, please drop a quick comment to let me know you're still following this journey. Just comment the word iron if you're standing strong with Mitchell. And a small heads up, the next part of this story contains some recreated details for narrative impact. If you'd prefer to stop here, I completely understand, and you can end the video now. The glass between us didn't feel thick enough. Not by a mile. Claire leaned in even closer, her voice dropping to a whisper that felt like a razor blade against my ear. "I didn't kill her memory, Mitch. I weaponized it," she hissed. She explained that she wasn't the one hacking the system. The device registered to my late wife wasn't being operated by a ghost, but by a shadow proxy, a pre-programmed AI Claire had built before her arrest. It mimicked Margaret's digital footprint perfectly, allowing it to stay invisible to the FBI while it dismantled my defenses. "Stop the clock, Claire. Tell me where the second key is." I demanded the absolute betrayal of her, using her mother's memory as code, making me nauseous. The hum of the prison's fluorescent lights felt like it was drilling into my skull. Claire claimed the second key wasn't an object, but a person, and that person was currently standing right outside the prison gates waiting for me. She pressed her palm to the glass, pointing toward the exit, where a silhouette stood near my truck. A silhouette that wore the same charcoal coat my wife was buried in. My boots hammered against the prison's linoleum, the sound echoing like gunfire in a hallway that suddenly felt 3 miles long. I burst through the final heavy set of gates into the parking lot, my lungs burning from the dry, sterile air of the facility. I didn't stop until I was within 10 feet of my truck, my eyes locked on the charcoal coat Claire had pointed out. The figure stood perfectly still, their back to me. "Who gave you that coat? Who are you?" I shouted, my voice cracking under the weight of a year's worth of repressed terror. The figure turned slowly, and the adrenaline spike nearly knocked me over. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't my late wife resurrected. It was a private courier, a scrawny kid in his 20s, looking terrified in a woman's charcoal wool coat that was 3 sizes too big for him. The kid held out a vintage flip phone that began ringing the second I was within reach. "I was paid $500 to stand here and hand you this phone when it rang." The kid stammered, the smell of damp wool rising from the coat. "That's it. I don't know nothing else." I snatched the phone from his shaking hand, realizing with a bitter pang that the silhouette was just a hollow decoy. Claire had designed this entire moment to trigger my fight-or-flight response, a theatrical cruelness she practiced like an art form. I flipped the phone open. The voice on the other end was distorted, a digital mask that hummed like a broken radiator. "You have 3 hours before the switch clears the ledger," the voice rasped, providing coordinates to a location in the Elmwood district I thought I'd left behind forever. "The second key isn't an object, Mitchell. It's a person waiting for you at those numbers." "Why should I trust a voice that sounds like a radiator?" I asked, but the line went dead. "Hope is a jagged piece of glass. The harder you grip it, the more you bleed, but you're too afraid to let it go and see where it falls." I stood beside my truck, the orange glow of the setting sun hitting the prison wire and casting long, barred shadows across the asphalt. I had the vintage phone in one hand and the weight of the FBI's demands in the other. Then my real phone vibrated in my pocket. A different ringtone, the kind that ends lives. I swiped to answer, expecting Agent Miller or Victor. Instead, the voice was weary and professional. "Mr. Pierce, this is Sarah with the Department of Children and Families. I'm calling about Emma Pierce Crawford. She was born in June 2023, over a year ago, via a surrogacy arrangement you and your late wife initiated in 2018. I gripped the truck for support. "That contract was canceled. The clinic refunded us." "No, sir. It was never canceled. It was transferred. Your daughter Claire became the legal coordinator in 2019 after your wife's health deteriorated. She told the surrogate you'd moved overseas for work. When Claire was arrested last November, the surrogate saw the news and contacted us. Emma has been in foster care since December. Your 2018 signature was verified as authentic by our forensic team." My blood turned to ice. "Claire hijacked my own surrogacy contract." "Yes, sir. You need to come to our office immediately." I stopped breathing. The air in the parking lot suddenly felt like water, thick and impossible to swallow. "I have a daughter," I whispered, the words sounding foreign in my own mouth. I learned in that moment that while I was grieving a marriage and fighting a legal war, a child had been born into the wreckage, a child I never knew existed. I demanded to know where she was, my mind, a structural failure of everything I thought I knew about the last year. "Mitchell," Sarah continued, her voice thin and sterile through the speaker. "You need to come to the office immediately. We can't keep her in emergency custody much longer. How do you grieve a child you didn't know existed while running from a ghost that won't stay dead?" I sat in the cab of my truck, the silence of the prison parking lot amplifying the caseworker's words until they were the only sound in the universe. Sarah's voice had dropped to a whisper, informing me that Claire wasn't the mother of the child I'd apparently fathered 4 months ago. I gripped the steering wheel, my mind a structural failure of logic and memory. I needed answers, But the vintage flip phone in my other hand was vibrating again, the digital radiator voice demanding I move. The coordinates it had provided weren't a new location at all. They were a cipher, a specific set of spatial measurements for the house I had just sold in the Elmwood district. The realization hit me like a falling girder. The anonymous buyer wasn't just a stranger, they were the final piece of Claire's board game. I didn't answer Agent Miller's frantic radio calls as I peeled out of the lot. "I am not coming in, Miller," I muttered to the empty dashboard. "I have a closing I actually care about." My obsessive focus was a narrow beam of light in a darkening world. Mirror. 15. 3. K. 4. The numbers repeated in my head, a rhythmic chant, as I tore through the Chicago twilight toward the house that was no longer mine. I reached the Elmwood district home, just as the streetlights flickered to life. I felt like a burglar in my own life, sliding through the back door with the practiced ease of a man who had spent 7 years maintaining every lock. The master bathroom was cold, smelling of damp drywall and old adhesive. I looked at the primary mirror, the one I had stared into while trying to find my own soul just months ago. I hadn't checked behind it, because it was sealed with heavy industrial adhesive, a permanent fixture in a temporary life. I grabbed a heavy crowbar from my truck and jammed it into the gap between the glass and the tile. The screech of the crowbar against the ceramic was a high-pitched scream. I leaned into the tool, my muscles straining. Glass. It doesn't just break. It screams. The mirror shattered, showering the floor and my boots in silver flakes of backing that looked like metallic snow. Behind the jagged shards carved directly into the drywall with the clinical precision of a scalpel was a small recessed cavity. My fingers brushed against something else. A small device the size of a deck of cards, warm to the touch. I pulled it into the light. A microserver with a blinking green LED labeled HVAC controller. This wasn't controlling heating. The Ethernet cable snaked through the wall, piggybacking on my own internet. This was the shadow proxy's brain, hidden in my house for 7 years, running on my electricity. Claire had built her weapon inside my sanctuary. I ripped it from the wall. The green light died. The ghost was finally offline. I reached inside my fingers, brushing against the cold plastic of a second hardware wallet, identical to the one the FBI was holding. Tucked beneath it was a handwritten note. I pulled it out, my pulse thudding in my ears. The script was unmistakable. It was my own handwriting, the same wise, reflective slant I used for my inspection reports. But I didn't write this. I whispered, my voice caught in the back of my throat. I couldn't have. The note was dated 3 days after Margaret had allegedly died, and it contained my secret personal PIN. Stop the clock. Save the girl. Do you want to know what it feels like to realize you're the villain in a story you haven't finished reading yet? I carried both wallets to the kitchen island, connecting them with a bridge cable I kept for field diagnostics. The rhythmic blue pulse of the hardware wallet light flickered against the marble, a digital heartbeat, synchronizing with the shadow proxy countdown. The timer began to slow, the crimson numbers turning to a steady clinical green as the data began to decrypt. I expected financial records or offshore accounts, but the file names that populated the screen made the blood drain from my face. They weren't ledgers. They were medical logs titled Emma_biological_source. Come on, you digital bastard. Open up, I hissed, my fingers flying over the keys. The final block of data decrypted with a soft chime. A photo flickered onto the screen, a hospital room with a man holding a baby. My face. But the metadata revealed the truth AI generated in 2023. Claire had edited my face onto the surrogate's partner's body, likely to convince the surrogate I was involved. Beneath the fake photo was the real document, my 2018 surrogacy contract, with Margaret notarized and sealed. My signature was authentic. I had signed this before the lies consumed everything. The fluorescent lights of the DCF lobby hummed with the same persistent drone as the questions in my head. But for the first time in a year, I wasn't looking for a way out. I sat on a hard plastic chair, my hands finally steady against my knees as I waited for Sarah. Outside in the parking lot, Agent Miller was probably still scrolling through the hardware wallets I had just surrendered. That folder contains everything I had told him the morning air finally tasting clean. Every wallet, every node, every name. It was the ultimate leverage. I bought my freedom and a clean birth certificate for a child I barely understood in exchange for the digital map that would dismantle Claire's laundering network forever. Miller had looked at me with a weary sort of respect, though his warning still echoed in the back of my mind. You're walking away with a ghost's child, Mitchell. Make sure you don't become one yourself. He didn't understand the shadow proxy. The software wasn't designed to destroy me, but to act as a digital trustee that would only release the truth and Emma's location once I had successfully severed the last tie to my old life by selling the Elmwood house. It was a fail-safe and engineering masterpiece of a different kind. Ever held a 6-month-old and realized they are the only thing in the world that doesn't care about your sins? The door opened, and Sarah led me into a small, quiet room that smelled of baby powder and antiseptic. She was carrying a bundle wrapped in a yellow blanket. Emma was 13 months old, with a tuft of dark hair and steady, curious eyes, and eyes that held the exact same shade of storm cloud gray as mine. As she placed the girl in my arms, the weight of her felt like a cornerstone being set in a new foundation. Sarah handed me a copy of the 2018 contract. I did remember signing this, Margaret, and I had been hopeful, planning for a future after Ethan left home. But within weeks, her kidney symptoms began. Clinic appointments stopped. I'd assumed the contract was voided. Now I understood the shadow proxy had been erasing fertility clinic emails for 5 years. Claire hijacked the entire process, hiding my biological child as a backup plan if the bank heist failed. Margaret's posthumous letter confirmed it. Claire found the contract in my desk in 2018. She saw an opportunity, a child she could use to control your inheritance if everything else failed. The baby was always yours, Mitchell. I tried to cancel it in 2020, but she'd already taken control. I couldn't stop her from hiding the truth. She's been waiting for you, Mr. Mitchell, Sarah said softly. I pulled the girl closer, feeling her small, rhythmic breath against my chest. I'm sorry it took me so long to find you, I whispered. She wasn't a reminder of a theft. She was the bridge Claire couldn't burn. We left Chicago that afternoon, the city skyline shrinking in the rearview mirror until it was nothing but a memory of steel and glass. I drove west, then south toward the Blue Ridge Mountains. Asheville smelled like wood smoke, and Old Secret's a perfect place for a man to bury a ghost and raise a daughter. The gravel crunched under my truck tires as I pulled up to a secluded cabin I had purchased through a blind trust months ago, another move the shadow proxy had facilitated. The crisp, thin air of the mountains felt like it was scrubbing my lungs clean of the industrial rot of the Elmwood district. I unloaded our few belongings under a canopy of autumn leaves, the oranges and reds of the trees reflecting the sunset. Emma slept through the transition, a warm, heavy weight against my shoulder as I carried her over the threshold. Just you and me now, kid, I said to the empty pine-scented rooms. I walked into the small kitchen and set her carrier down on the counter. Beside a stack of new blueprints sat a single envelope addressed to me. The handwriting was unmistakable. It belonged to my late wife, Margaret, the real Margaret, before the illness and the lies. It was a final piece of the foundation proving she knew about the surrogacy and endorsed it before the world went dark. I opened the envelope with trembling fingers, but before I could read the first line, the vintage flip phone from the courier, the one I thought I'd thrown away in a rest stop bin 300 miles back, buzzed once in my pocket. The vibration felt like a jolt of electricity. I reached down and pulled it out, the screen glowing in the mountain silence. The plastic of the flip phone felt warm against my palm, a living relic of a year I thought I'd buried in the red clay of Elmwood. I stood in the absolute silence of the Asheville cabin, watching the moon rise over the jagged Blue Ridge horizon. I flipped the phone open, my thumb grazing the worn buttons as I brought it to my ear. I expected Claire's cold, calculated voice, but what I heard instead was "Guard Derek." Derek's voice was a gravelly mess of panic and unearned confidence, the sound of a man who had stepped into a game way over his head. Claire thought she bought me Mitchell. He hissed, the static of the connection crackling with the distance. But she didn't realize I knew about the hardware wallet. I realized then that the voice on the phone wasn't a ghost or a mastermind, but the very man who had helped the shadow proxy operate from within the prison walls. He had turned on her, his greed outweighing any loyalty she'd bought with siphoned crypto. He was demanding the codes I had just handed over to the FB. I convinced he could intercept the fortune for himself. "She's not with you, Derek," I said, my voice steady with a finality that made him hesitate. "She's exactly where she belongs." I listened as Derek's panic escalated, describing the chaos currently unfolding at the correctional facility. Claire had attempted a physical escape through a maintenance tunnel, using the shadow proxy as a digital smokescreen. Greed is a louder engine than love. Derek proved that with every word, but the plan had been a structural failure from the start. By handing the hardware keys to Agent Miller earlier that morning, I hadn't just secured my freedom. I had inadvertently triggered a high-level security lockdown that sealed the tunnel before she could reach the perimeter. "You sold her out, didn't you?" Derek snarled. "You gave the feds the map." I watched the orange embers in the fireplace pop and hiss. "I didn't sell her out," I replied. I just finally closed the door. The line went dead with the sudden sharp wail of sirens on his end, leaving me alone with the mountain wind and the distant hoot of an owl. I set the flip phone on the mantel and picked up the envelope I'd been holding. The stationery was old, the texture smooth and familiar. It wasn't a message from Claire. It was a delayed legal delivery from my first wife, Margaret. I read her words by the light of the fire, the truth finally surfacing from beneath 7 years of silt. She explained that she had seen the rot in Claire early on, long before the accident. Margaret's letter explained she had commissioned the original shadow proxy years ago, a digital trustee designed to protect Emma's custody documents. But Claire discovered the code, reverse-engineered it, and weaponized it. The AI that attacked me was a corrupted version of the tool Margaret built to save me. The surrogacy with Emma had been her final gift, a bridge she'd built to carry me across the river of my own grief. How many lives do we have to burn before we realize we're the ones holding the match? I felt a cathartic peace settle into my bones, a structural integrity I hadn't felt since I was a young man inspecting my first span of steel. "Live for the both of us, Mitchell." The letter concluded in her elegant hand. "The girl is yours. She always was." I walked over to the next room and watched the steady, quiet breathing of my daughter for a long minute. She was the only reality that mattered now. I returned to the hearth, picked up the vintage flip phone and tossed it into the glowing embers. I watched the screen melt and the plastic curl, the last ghost of the Elmwood district, flickering out in a small blue flame. I tossed the phone into the embers and watched the screen melt, the last ghost of the Elmwood district, flickering out until all that remained was the steady, quiet breathing of my daughter in the next room. Time used to be a countdown. I couldn't stop, but today it was just the rhythm of a toddler's laughter echoing against the cedar walls of our cabin. I stood on the porch, the smell of fresh pine and the faint, sweet scent of birthday candles lingering in the spring air. 15 months had passed since I gained custody, and the world felt fundamentally different. Emma was approaching her 2nd birthday. I wasn't just hiding in the mountains. I had become something new. I was now the preeminent consultant for the FBI, spending my days tracking the very laundering systems and shadow proxies that had nearly erased me. Turning my trauma into my greatest asset was the only way to ensure the structural integrity of my future. I watched Emma in the yard, her dark hair catching the morning sun. She was thriving, possessing a stubborn streak that reminded me of the best parts of the woman I had truly loved. 2 years, Emma, I said, leaning against the porch railing. You're catching up to the world. She looked up from her wooden playset, her face bright with a purely innocent joy. "Dot a cake?" she asked. And I couldn't help but smile, a genuine expression that no longer felt like a heavy lift for my facial muscles. Peace isn't the absence of the storm. It's the solid foundation you build after the house has been leveled. I had spent my life inspecting bridges, but the one I had built here between a scarred past and this child's future was the only one that truly mattered. I retreated to my small office later that morning, the mechanical click of my secure keyboard, a familiar grounding soundtrack. I was closing out a consultancy contract, my screens filled with the digital signatures of crimes I now helped prevent. A notification blinked on my primary monitor, an encrypted message from Agent Miller. He was no longer the hunter, and I was no longer the prey. We were simply two men who knew too much about the dark. "The ledger is clean, Mitchell," the message read. "The final legal threads of the case are officially sealed. Stay off the radar." I typed back a short, reflective reply. I've never liked the view from the radar anyway. I closed the laptop, feeling a sense of professional vindication that went deeper than any paycheck. I had taken the weapons used against me and turned them into a shield. While checking my secure server one last time, I found a small benign file that had been sitting dormant for months. It was a self-destructing message, timed to execute only when the federal cases were fully closed. I watched as the code unspooled, revealing a final piece of advice from my first wife about the crypto wealth I'd inherited from the cleansed accounts. "You did it, Mitch," the text whispered across the screen. "You got her home. You stop looking over your shoulder eventually, not because the ghosts are gone, but because you finally realize they can't keep up." I walked back out onto the porch, the cool mountain breeze at dusk brushing against my face. Emma was sitting on the steps, the sticky feel of chocolate frosting on her fingers as she pointed at the setting sun. I realized then that I wasn't just surviving. I was finally living the life that had been intended for me before the tragedy of the Elmwood district intervened. I had kept a fragment of the shadow proxy, a silent guardian tucked away in a private server, to act as a permanent failsafe for Emma's financial security. It was my final engineering project, a bridge that would never collapse. As the sun dipped below the Blue Ridge, casting long purple shadows across the yard, a single unmarked envelope appeared in the mailbox. It wasn't from a courier, and it wasn't a ghost from the past. I walked down the gravel path to retrieve it, noticing a return address I never expected to see again. When I look back at everything that happened, I realize this family story was never just about money or betrayal. It was about how easily love can blind us. For 7 years, I believed sacrifice meant loyalty, and silence meant strength. But this family story taught me something: painful devotion without awareness can turn a man into the easiest target in his own home. My so-called dad revenge was never about destroying the people who hurt me. The real dad revenge was reclaiming my life, protecting my daughter, and refusing to let bitterness define the rest of my years. If there's one lesson from this family story, it's this: never ignore the small cracks in the foundation of trust. They rarely stay small. I believe God sometimes allows storms to reveal what must be rebuilt. And through that storm, I found the one thing worth protecting: my child, and the chance to live honestly again. So if you ever face betrayal, remember this: strength isn't revenge, it's clarity. My dad revenge ended the day I chose peace over hatred and a future over the ruins of the past. That to me is the real ending of this family story. Thank you for staying with me until the end of this journey. I'd truly like to hear your thoughts. What would you have done if you discovered your own family secretly replacing you and stealing your identity? Share your perspective in the comments. If this story resonated with you, consider subscribing so you don't miss future stories. And a quick note: while this narrative draws inspiration from complex family conflicts, some elements have been dramatized for storytelling purposes. If this kind of story isn't your preference, Feel free to explore other videos that may suit you better.